Hello everyone, this is Mr. Schultz, and this is AP Biology video 2.5. This is going to be the rise of the eukaryotes. It's going to talk a little bit about where eukaryotes came from, and it's going to cover some basic evolution information for this group of organisms. This is going to cover Biology in Focus 25.1, but it's being thrown in with the cells unit just because it talks a little bit about like where do some of these organelles and things come from. So first, let's talk a little bit about protists. Protists are a kingdom in biology that covers a whole bunch of unicellular eukaryotes. So they have a nucleus, but for the most part they're single-celled, with a few exceptions. Like algae tends to clump together and they end up being unicellular, but they're still protists. They could live by themselves. So they are incredibly diverse. There are literally hundreds upon hundreds, thousands of these protists. And because each one is single-celled and because they're really different and unique, they could probably be divided into a bunch of different kingdoms. And because of that, we just kind of clump them all together. So there are some that do photosynthesis. So algae do this and diatoms do this, but like some don't. A paramecium or an amoeba might not. So they have a bunch of different characteristics, but what they do have in common is that they're all single-cell, or for most part single-celled. And they're all just kind of unique and different in their own ways. So just keep in mind that protists are a group of eukaryotes. So if you see something about like a protist, this is what they're talking about. An example of an important protist might be a paramecium and their water pump system within their cells, which allow them to pump water out because they live in freshwater systems and they have a lot of salt in their bodies and other nutrients so they have a negative water potential. And what happens is water wants to move into the cell and spread it out, and that would be bad for the paramecium. So they have the ability to pump water out of them. So the rise of the eukaryotes. All life on the planet, as far as we can tell, started as unicellular. We have evidence for this. We have fossil records of unicellular life in some of our older rocks. Eukaryotes, to be a eukaryote, have to have membrane-bound organelles, and they have to have a cytoskeleton. Prokaryotes don't have these things. So prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, they don't have an endoplasmic reticulum, they don't have vacuoles, they don't have those inner membranes like a eukaryote will. And fossils show that prokaryotes, the predecessors of eukaryotes, have been around for probably about 3.5 billion years. And we have evidence of eukaryotes showing up around 2.7 billion years ago, which would be our ancient ancestors that are single-celled. For the most part, prokaryotes were around for quite a while, actually. So we're looking at a long time. So about 0.8 billion years or 800 million years before eukaryotes started to come about. Now, so let's talk a little bit about the fossil record and what we know. By about 1.8 billion years ago, eukaryotes had actually diversified. So if we go back, we have evidence of eukaryotes at 2.7 billion years ago, but by 1.8 we had a lot of different kinds of eukaryotes showing up in our fossil record. By 1.2 billion years ago, algae started to show up in our fossil record, which algae is generally just all photosynthetic protists put together, and they're identified and categorized. So we actually start seeing different kinds of algae. It's not just one kind, it's a whole bunch of different kinds. So at this point, we can assume that photosynthesis was taking place and other structures were probably beginning to diversify as well. It's important to understand that for a long time, there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere of the Earth. And it was because algae started to take in carbon dioxide and sunlight and turn it into oxygen and sugars through photosynthesis that we started to see oxygen build up in the oceans. And then what's probably going to happen is eventually there was so much oxygen built up in the oceans that it burst out of the ocean and started to fill the atmosphere, which allowed for life to move onto the land. But that's quite a ways away. About 635 million years ago, we saw what was called the Ediacaran biota. There are a whole bunch of soft-bodied multicellular organisms that develop. So we start to see multicellular life start to really take off. We don't have a ton of really great fossils for this time period because it appears that everything pretty much had soft bodies with a few exceptions. And about 535 million years ago, about 100 million years later, the Cambrian explosion occurred. Now, it doesn't mean like an explosion as in like everything gets destroyed. Instead, what happened was there was a major extinction event, and there were a whole bunch of what we call niches or roles that opened up for a bunch of organisms to take over. And so a lot of the Ediacaran biota died off. And instead, there were a whole bunch of open opportunities, and so a whole bunch of new organisms began to develop and evolve. And this is where we see the major diversification of multicellular organisms. And there are some crazy cool things in the Cambrian explosion. If you're interested in the Cambrian fossils and things like that, you can actually do some fossil hunting in the Rockies, but it's very hard to get to them. The Canadian Rockies have some fantastic Cambrian fossils, but you have to take a helicopter to get there. And there are all sorts of really cool things that you can look at for the Cambrian explosion up there. But you'd have to get there, which is the hard part. Now, one of the important parts of this section is the endosymbiont theory. Endo meaning inner, symbiosis meaning to live together. And so it's thought that mitochondria and plastids were formerly small prokaryotes that have been living within larger within larger cells. This is endosymbiosis, inner living together. So an endosymbiont is going to be a cell living within another cell. And it's thought that the ancestors of mitochondria and plastids were originally just undigested food or parasites. We're not sure which one. I would like to think that it's probably leaning more towards food than parasites, because it wouldn't make sense necessarily that a parasitic photosynthetic organism would want to live inside of another one unless for protection, which could be a possibility. So as the world became more oxygenated, it would have been beneficial to have endosymbiotes that could process this new chemical, oxygen gas. And so what happens is, we think, is that mitochondria probably evolved before plastids. So you can look at the sequence in the image before. And what happened is we think that a cell ate another cell, a smaller cell, and it did something that was beneficial. And so instead of eating that cell down to its parts and just using it for energy that way, it kept it around and used it instead for harnessing that energy, whether it be photosynthesis or cellular respiration, which are both really nice to have if you're a cell, because now you can make your own oxygen and sugar. Awesome. I now have an unlimited source of energy as long as I have sunlight and carbon dioxide. Or I could be using that oxygen and the sugars around me to harness it and make more ATP, which means my cell can do many more things, which is really important. So we have a bunch of evidence for the endosymbiosis theory. Both mitochondria and plastids, so our chloroplasts, have enzymes and transport systems that are homologous to living prokaryotes. Homologous means that they have the same structure, okay? So they have similar structure to prokaryotes that are still living today. They replicate similar to prokaryotes and have circular DNA. So mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA, and it's very similar to protist DNA. They have their own cellular machinery. They have their own ribosomes. They can make their own ribosomes. They don't need the cell to make them for them, which would suggest that at one point they were probably their own cell. And ribosomes are more similar to prokaryotic ribosomes than they are to eukaryote ribosomes, which would also suggest that they probably came from eukaryotes. Now, if you look at the inferred origins of key eukaryotic features here on the slide, the DNA replication enzymes are really similar to archaea, which is another type of protist. There are archaea and bacteria. Archaea are usually our extremophiles. The transcription enzymes, which is for making proteins, similar to archaea. Translation enzymes, part of making proteins, mostly archaeal. Cell division apparatus, how the actual parts, like your mitochondria, divide, seems to be mostly archaeal. The endoplasmic reticulum is archaeal and bacterial, so there is some ER in some protists. The mitochondrion, the endoplasmic reticulum appears to be archaeal or bacteria in nature. Sorry, that's what it meant. The mitochondria appear to be bacterial, so it was some sort of bacteria. And the metabolic genes, which code for a lot of like the proteins and things that go into metabolism, seem to be mostly bacterial. So here's our thing, our diagram. We start with DNA and cytoplasm and an ancestral prokaryote, a very basic cell. And it's thought that a nuclear envelope might have developed on its own through folding of the membrane. And as it did so, it might have been eating other bacteria, particularly like an aerobic heterotrophic prokaryote, which means that it was eating what would have been a mitochondria before it was a mitochondria. And it turned it into a mitochondria by simply providing it with protection, and that mitochondria eventually lost some of its functions, so that it could live within the cell. And we think the same thing happened with plastids or chloroplasts and similar organelles, where eventually they were eaten and pulled in. And you might be wondering, well, if we didn't have chloroplasts, how was photosynthesis taking place and sugars being made? Well, you have to remember that photosynthesis doesn't come originally from eukaryotes. It comes from prokaryotes, which were able to harness certain wavelengths of sun to make sugars via a bunch of different controlled chemical reactions. So photosynthesis actually originates from bacteria, specifically our what are they called? The not red-green algae, that's a protist, cyanobacteria, which are able to harness sunlight to make sugars. So this is the end of the endosymbiosis theory. It's a lot of information to take in, but for the most part, it's just about the evolution of eukaryotes and how did we get mitochondria and chloroplasts, which are really important for cell energy, which is going to lead us into our next unit, which is going to be photosynthesis, respiration, and metabolism. So it's kind of important to understand that these originally were probably their own cells, and our cells, not our cells, but our ancestors' cells, pulled them in and kept them around to keep them for beneficial purposes. And so this is the end of these notes, and we'll be starting on cellular respiration, photosynthesis, and metabolism next.